For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePointset. Welcome back to the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. I'm your host, Bruce Pointset, and this is the show where we take the book Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation by Jeff Chang, and new edition out right now by Jeff Chang and my guest today, Mr. Davey D, legendary hip hop journalist, co-author again of the new edition. Davey D, how are you doing this morning, first off?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Ready to rock and roll, and semester's just starting. So I teach, hip hop down here at SF State. And, big shout out to everybody up in the Portland area. We're on every day on Cable. So, our show from down here is broadcast up there. So we're good.
Yeah. It's actually kind of like a cool moment for me because, I've been familiar with your work since probably, I want to say like junior high. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Like they post your articles on, obviously they have like Davey D's Hip Hop Corner, but then, they also post your articles on All Hip Hop and some of these other sites. So,
right. Wow. Okay.
And
well, I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, my editor actually, you talk about Cable, like, yeah, we used to listen, to like Democracy Now! In the mornings, and then sort of like the evening runs at the end of the day include your show. So like I said, it's a little bit of a full circle moment. But to bring it back to the book though, I'm curious, like, when did you first, get connected to, like, when did you first read Can't Stop, Won't Stop?
Well, I mean, I knew, me and Jeff went to college together. So I know Jeff way before the book came out. I knew Jeff when he was working on the book. So it's all a blur. Obviously, I probably read it like the first time I got it. Because I knew how much he was working on it. So that's, guess early 2000s, was probably when it first dropped. Coincidentally, around that time, I was working on a book, and the book was actually supposed to come out. And so the story behind that was I had my gallery copies, I had my computer, and I had the backup drives. Coincidentally, went into the station on my way back from a library doing the finishing touches, stopped in to say hello, came out, car was stolen. And I lost all that, and never really recovered all that work that I had done. And so when I had the opportunity to join Jeff to do the edition, it was good. I finally got a chance to come around. Some of the things that were lost, at least in the old notes and, previous iterations, we were able to incorporate, into the new one. And here we are, with something I think is really good.
Yeah, it's always a heartbreaking story when you hear,
yeah,
this happened. All my files were here. I had this project gone. So
yeah.
Yikes.
Well, somebody just stole the card. They found the card the next day. Apparently it was stolen with somebody who had a master key to the type of car I had, which was a Saturn. And they found it over there in South Berkeley. And I was begging that, at least the hard drive would be there, and nothing was there. I did find one gallery copy that I did have. And so I had a little bit of the iterations, but what was ready to come out was gone for good.
Dang. Well, we're gonna get to the new edition, but first, I'm curious as, one, a hip hop historian, but two, especially like based in Oakland, based in the West Coast, your thoughts on, in the original version, sort of the contextualizing of like late 80s, early 90s West Coast hip hop. And particularly, Jeff had this passage or this section, Dub History of Boys in the Hood, where he talks about yeah, Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson, the attempted prison break, and a whole story behind that for people watching, including trying to frame Angela Davis. So, for those who are not familiar with the history watching this, I highly encourage you to look that up. But yeah, Jeff had this passage here, which I'm just going to read real quick, and I want to get your reaction on it. He writes, Jonathan Jackson's rebellion had been fearless, inarticulate, and fatal. George mourned his brother by writing, I want people to wonder at what forces created him. Terrible, vindictive, cold, calm, man-child. Courage in one hand, machine gun in the other. Scourge of the unrighteous. He considered Jonathan a soldier of the people, an image that would find a different resonance in Los Angeles street wars of the 80s. Whether Cube had intended to or not, Boys in the Hood recovered that painful memory. Tracking the lives of Compton Hard Rocks, knowing nothing in life but to be legit, Boys in the Hood became an anthem for the fatherless, brotherless, state-assaulted, heavily armed West Coast urban youth, a generation of Jonathan Jacksons. The impact of Boys had to do with its affirmation, its boast. We're taking over now. Yeah, so kind of curious, like how you react to that passage.
Well, I mean, he's looking at a very true story that happened. And if you know the story behind Jonathan and his brother George, remember George was somebody who went to jail. He was just supposed to be there for a year. And the way the California laws were set up, he was there for, he died in prison at the end of the day. He was there much longer than a year. And, he got politicized. The act of Jonathan just kind of reminds me of Black rage, fed up, willing to fight back. You might not have all the words. You might not have all the perfect, rationale, if you will, or your T's all crossed and I's all dotted, but something's wrong. Something is dreadfully wrong. And you're going to fight back. And I think what he was talking about or capturing was urban rage. Hip hop was born out of that. You heard it. It was born out of urban rage in the Bronx. And when it came to the West Coast, that urban rage was still there. It wasn't just a unique thing to a particular area. All around the country, it was there. And urban rage is a byproduct of systemic inequality. It's a byproduct of ongoing police terrorism. It's a byproduct of being demonized instead of being nurtured. And it's a byproduct of a system that now has an entire ecosystem that benefits greatly off of Black pain, Black death, and Black dysfunctionality. And so the narrative that was constructed in the song Boys in the Hood, which talks about that court scene, that's not the first time there's been an outburst in court. It has happened before. This way you can connect it because we're on the West Coast to what was happening, what happened, probably a good 10, 15 years prior to it coming out with Jonathan, but it represents pushing back on a system that never gave a damn about you in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Right. So kind of to that end, because I think it's one of the things that's just been powerful about the book, and obviously kind of like capturing that story, is just like making those connections, especially for like, I think about just my generation, being especially like outside of these places, being in somewhere like Portland, where, the context you get, or I should say you get a lot of this like music, but with like the lack of context. It's just what you see in the music video. It's just the history is told by some of the music. So connecting it to, especially these revolutionary movements, is a powerful thing. But yeah.
So, the thing that makes Can't Stop, Won't Stop, both versions attractive, is that what we centered around was not so much the artist. We tell stories through the eyes of artists, obviously Crazy Legs, Kool Herc, and others who we spotlight. But Black music / Black expression does not form in a vacuum. What is around it are the social and political dynamics that in many ways inform it, that we react with and react to. And so I think what makes this book stand the proverbial test of time and what allows it to jump from one community to the next, even if you were born post NWA, there's a lot of people reading this that were born in 2000, 2010 who are reading this. Doesn't matter, because the conditions that NWA was dealing with is not much different than the conditions that Kool Herc was dealing with, is not much different than the folks who were part of the Watts Rebellion were dealing with, is not much different than what, our great grandparents were dealing with in the 30s and 20s and what have you. How we express ourselves in the face of such inequality and such systemic challenges is something that I think people can relate to. In one generation, we were swinging. Another generation, we were bebopping. In another generation, we were soulful. In another generation, we were functified. The other generation, we were hip hop. And in hip hop has evolved in so many different ways. We're bouncing in New Orleans. We're crunking in Atlanta. We were hyphy in the Bay. We were snapping in another part of the country. We were screwing, all these different names that were given to Black expression all come out of the same seed. The expression comes out of the same seed. The dances come out of the same seed, making a way out of no way, making sure that the policies of abandonment in some cities or the politics of containment in other cities, two sides to the same group of people are expendable. Contain them, keep them in Watts. That was the LA thing. These Black people are expendable, abandon them. That's what I grew up in. It's the same situation coming from the same power dynamics that says, we don't think you count. And the challenge for us is, how do we take these expressions and use them as a tool for healing and upliftment? And sure, if there's some financial benefit out of it, that'd be great too. But ultimately, people are going to have some form of communicating to each other and to themselves the hardships that they're enduring, the triumphs that they feel, when they overcome some of these hardships. And that's really what the book is about. Hip hop is, it's the entry point to these larger conversations. So like I said, you weren't around, if I'm looking at you and I'm assuming that you're younger, you definitely weren't around when George Jackson was in jail and killed and the Soledad brothers and all that, but you can relate to it. You can read that and be like, damn, okay, now you have the particular details to a story, but this feeling and the spirit behind it, you can relate to. And hip hop has always been able to capture that sort of spirit, which is why I think it's so widespread, which is why it's in all 6 or 7 continents around the world. You can go to Australia and you'll see people reacting to oppression. You can go to France reacting to oppression. You can go to various countries on the continent in South America. All that is how we dance with inequality and systemic conditions that are challenging to us. So that's why I think the book is relatable, because we brought to the forefront those conditions and showed how people were able to battle them.
Yeah. And, the first time I got heard of the book was on this presentation doing kind of just what you're talking about, making that connection with the politics of abandonment, specifically with, the South Bronx and the South Bronx Expressway cutting through, this community the benign neglect policies,
Mhm.
landlords having people literally burn down buildings just to collect the insurance, and basically a presentation connecting that with Portland and the I-5 freeway cutting through the community, the continual displacement with whether it be Memorial Coliseum, Legacy Emmanuel Hospital, and I mean to this day.
So let's just stop there. You have the Interstate 5 cutting through a community,
Right.
right? We had, what do we start off with? We talk about the Cross Bronx Expressway, displacing 60,000 families, right?
Mm.
In the South Bronx, where I'm from. Go to San Francisco, what do we have? Gary Boulevard going right through the Fillmore. In Oakland, what do we have? We had the Cypress Freeway cutting through West Oakland, which was the Harlem of the West. Go to Chicago. Every city had the same systemic thing. Black communities having a freeway go right through the heart of them. For what? So white people could leave the city and go to the suburbs and what we call white flight, right? There's documentaries that talk about this. You watch this documentary that the writer James Baldwin did. He goes to Hunters Point in San Francisco. You close your eyes, you swear to God he's talking about your city. Oh, he must be talking about Detroit. Somebody in Chicago goes, no, he's talking about Chicago. Somebody in Portland could probably close their eyes and go, no, James Baldwin is interviewing a bunch of brothers from Portland. And because it all sounds the same, the brothers and their frustration sounds the same. The challenges that they're facing sound the same. It just has a different street name, but the street, what it bears is the same. And so, yeah, the displacement and the disruption of community is an American thing. It's as American as apple pies, they would say. And through that, blues gets invented. Through that, jazz gets invented. Through that, these other artistic things that eventually get commodified, get quote unquote invented, and they serve a purpose. It helps us, survive those times.
Yeah, and the other part with Portland's history is that I-5 and then Memorial Coliseum especially also cut through the historic, basically jazz central of the city. It's called Jumptown at the time. So there's that other, like a lot of people have no idea around here that, we had this national hub of, jazz talent, or where jazz talent, I should say, came through. And obviously we had some great musicians of our own, but
right.
Yeah, that history gets, forgotten. But to kind of bring it up to the new book, can you just talk a little bit about why, I asked Jeff this too, but like why, 2021 was kind of the right time for a new edition?
Well, it was actually supposed to be 2020 to celebrate the 15th anniversary of that book. And the feeling was like there's a new generation that could probably appreciate it. Why don't we kind of fill the gaps of things that weren't put in the first book? Let's target young adults and basically update it. But in the middle of doing that, the pandemic hit. And within the pandemic, the George Floyd thing hit. And after George Floyd, the 2020 elections hit. And so all these things were happening, which said, we got to put this on hold and we got to capture these moments because they were so transformative. If we had left those out, the book would seem dated, considering like, man, why did you talk about the pandemic? You know how many people died during the pandemic? How did you miss that? No, we were going to capture that. Why didn't you talk about the election? Do you know this was the largest election in American history? No, we had to capture that. Why didn't you talk about, the millions of people that came out after George Floyd? Hip hop was always about, lifting up that type of voice. We had to capture it. So we put things on hold to capture those moments. And then it came out, spring of 2021. And we're glad we did. I think it just was a good bookend to how the book starts, with the city of death, Necropolis, politics of abandonment. And here we are, 40 some odd years later, or close to 40 or 50 years, close to 50 years later, we're still faced with similar challenges.
And I'm curious, was there a particular addition to this new version or a story, I guess, that resonated with you the most?
Well, some of the things that we did was we were very intentional about bringing to the forefront the presence of women. Or there's a robust chapter of women in the book, but we just didn't want to tokenize it. And so you probably see through all the chapters, like if you walked in the room and we're telling the story, then, we made sure that the contributions of women were there. Those stories were told from Shah Rock to Queen Latifah, all the way down to Cardi B, et cetera, et cetera. And we felt that was important because the notion is that hip hop's a male dominated endeavor. And from my growing up, women were always present. They just weren't spectators. They were participants and contributors, sometimes directly, as it was the case with Kool Herc's sister, Cindy, who actually organized that party for him, to, me being an MC and lifting generous portions of my older female cousins' rhymes when they were doing their nursery rhymes. Engine, number 9, Miss Mary Mac, let me take some of them things and put them in my own repertoire, right? So it was important to make sure that they were present. The other thing that we were intentional about was realizing that going back and telling the Kool Herc story and the Bambaataa story and the Flash story was something that not too many people are going to really be able to do anymore, right? I think Jeff laid a blueprint that would be hard to really come up with something new, because he told it from the lens of politics and social conditions. So there may be some pioneers like, DXT has a book coming out, and others, but just knowing them, they're just going to be adding to that political backdrop. There's no way they can just tell the story. The only thing that would make the difference is like they can say, I was actually here, more than maybe somebody else could. But everybody else, if you're living in Portland like you're like, well, what was our history? If you're living in Detroit, what was our history? If you're living in Houston, what was our history? Knowing that in order to tell those stories, it doesn't begin when you hear Sugar Hill Gang in 1979. There was a music scene in all those places that Black youth engaged. And so the question is, how did that scene interact with hip hop as it emerged out of New York? So there was a dance scene in all these cities. There was a funk or band scene and music scene that Black people centered themselves around in all these cities. And telling that history, I think, is important. And then chronicling that history all the way up to particular artists and communities' involvement with hip hop as we know it are important. And so we, in telling the story, said, let's give people a little tidbit. We can't tell the whole story of Portland. So we might mention the Lifesavers or Mike Crenshaw or a couple other people. We can't tell the whole history of Seattle. So we'll prop up a Sir Mix-a-Lot and Nasty Mix Records and Nasty Ness. Can't tell the whole story of New Orleans. So we're going to give you bits and pieces. And we expect, somebody like you, Bruce, or somebody in Seattle, which they've already done, or the people in Detroit, which they've already done, to say, hold my coffee, hold my beer. We got it from here. Thank you. We were just setting the table. Here comes the meal. And we expect and anticipate and want to uplift those localized stories, because that's the beauty of Black people and our ingenuity. That's the beauty of our, respective collective histories. And and you all can do the justice that needs to be done. What we did for you, in theory, is like you don't have to go back to the Kool Herc story no more. We gave you that jump off. You can read the book and go, okay, you already know the Kool Herc story. We give you a nice mention. This is what was going on in New York, blah, blah, blah. We give a chapter to it, and the other 10 chapters are going to focus on Portland's history, music history, and you're going to talk about that connection with the jazz and the central, districts in Seattle and what have you, and what that meant. And people there will be like, that's our legacy. That's important. And when you really look at hip hop in New York, there was a Bronx history, there was a Queens history, there was a Brooklyn history, because they're all in the same cities. But there's 2 million people where I'm from in the Bronx, and it's probably 1 million people in my section alone. And every block had a history. There's a Bronx River housing project history. There's a Bronx Dale history. So Bambaataa and Zulu Nation, Jazzy J come out of Bronx River. That's a whole expansive history. Bronxdale, which was the division number 1 for the Black Spades, the largest gang in New York, has its own history with Disco King Mario and Chuck City Crew. That's a whole history. The home of Judge Sotomayor was also the home of Andre Harrell out of Bronxdale, right? It was the home of Paradise Gray, founding member of X-Clan, right? Then we come to where I'm at in Soundview, right? So Peter Guns comes out of there. But before Peter Guns, there was the Jazzy 5 MCs comes out of Soundview, right? And we're talking about housing developments that have tens of thousands of people, right? Some of them have their own high schools, right? You go up to Edenwall housing projects, and around that area, Grand Mixer, DST, Funky 4 plus one more. These all have deep and rich histories, and these are just housing projects. So we feel it's important that everybody give voice to their lived experiences and connect the dots to the politics that, in many ways they had to engage. And so our job, when we talked about it, let's give a little tidbit, let's acknowledge, because we didn't want people to read the book and go, yo, how come you didn't tell the whole Portland story? We know there's a Portland story. So we shouted it out, or we gave like a brief mention, because no way we can do 30 years of justice to a particular city, that may have different divisions in that city, right? And different generations. So that's up to other people. But it was our way of making sure that there was some acknowledgement. Here's the platform, let's jump off. And of course, adding those final chapters around Black Lives Matter and all that was important too, to acknowledge what was going on up to the little last moment before we went to publishing was important for us.
And it was a great segue, actually, because I was lucky enough to talk with both Crenshaw and Versatile from the Lifesavers for this project. And Verse, especially, in the times I've been able to speak with him, whether for interviews or just otherwise, is always talking about the history, sort of what you talked about with, the early, even like pre-hip hop, the early funk scene that set it up, the radio personalities, the B-boys and B-girls from back in the day. And I mean, it kind of got me excited about trying to put together just some kind of a project around like the old Imperial skating rink in Portland, but that's another story. But
let's stop there for a second. What's going on right now? What's going on at this moment around the country? What are they doing?
In what regard, I guess?
Related to what we're talking about. What is going on all around the country?
The infrastructure projects?
They're banning history.
Got it.
Right? What Verse is talking about, when we talk about hip hop history, the European or Western construct is to say what album came out, how many did those albums sell, who got an award for that album, and say that's the history. what Verse is saying without even hearing his quote, but just knowing their work. He's like, there's a reason why we did the songs that we did. There's a legacy that we built off of. So in order to tell the story, we got to go back to what you mentioned. There was a freeway that cut through our area. There was a jazz scene that existed, because that jazz scene wasn't for old people when it happened. It was for our counterparts who were in their 20s and 30s at a particular point in time. On a Saturday night, they was like, we going down to the club, and it was the jazz scene that they went to, or the blues scene, right? Or whatever, right? And that was important to capture those moments. What was the dances they were doing? What were they experiencing at that time? That's how we get our history. That's how we soak it up and go, oh, I didn't know. Let me give you a story. My grandma, when she was alive on my mother's side, would pull up her drink and say, sit down and start telling these stories. And I couldn't really appreciate what she was talking about. Like, when I was your age, blah, 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 blah. What are you talking about? And I remember showing my Nana, that's what we called her, like, we do this thing called breaking. What's that? Well, we danced, and I did like a little corkscrew, put my right leg behind my left knee, drop down, twirl around. That's breaking, Grant. You know what she says to me? That ain't SH, beep, beep. Why do you say that? I mean, people are spinning on their heads. They're doing windmills. She said, yeah, I'll be impressed when y'all can do it with a partner. Didn't understand what she's talking about. Like, we don't do no breaking with no partner. We do our thing. This is pre-YouTube. This is pre-movies and all that. We just thought, like, this is incredible what they're doing. But years later, I get to see what she was talking about. She's like, oh, yeah, when we used to go to the Savoy in Harlem, I know what she's talking about. Then now I know, like, oh, you was dancing at the Savoy. You're one of those people that danced all the time. And when she said she was doing it with a partner, when I started to see those videos of people doing jitterbugs in the Charleston and the acrobatics and the precision, you can see some of those dances online. Like, yo, grandma got down. In fact, she probably got down more than we got down, because it was so energetic. It was so, awe-inspiring. But as I got older, it reminded me every generation got its awe-inspiring moments. Everybody got a tale to tell. And it's up to us to bring it to the forefront, because they're not going to teach it in school. They're not even going to put it in documentaries, because they're going to have a different agenda. But for us to know that, to be like, oh man, your grandma did that. When I looked at those videos, have a deeper appreciation, then I want to know that history. And then you start to hear names like Norma Mailer and the Whitings and all these other folks, and you start to like, let me study that. And let me go back to the Harlem Renaissance, and oh wow, I didn't know they had battles on the dance floor. Right? I thought we was unique. No, we've always done that. And so why do we want to know this history? Do we do it for history's sake? We do it so we can be complete. We do it so we can really connect to the ancestors. We often say they're an ancestor now. Well, what do you know about your ancestors? They're watching over you. Do they know you? Do you know them? Why would they watch over you if you ain't even taking time to know them? So I think it's important that we do that. And I think when we really look at our history, there's something to be said about knowing the past so we can go forward, i.e. Sankofa. It's important to connect on that spiritual plane so we can get that energy so that we're not reinventing the wheel. So ultimately, the book was the jump off so people can take that baton and do exactly what I'm describing. Talk to your grandma, talk to your grandpa, and get that history, that rich history, and know it the way that you know the back of your hand, and build off it. And so that's where we're at.
Yeah, you talk about building off that history. I just think right now with, in Portland, we've seen, I guess, you'd say Amine is probably the most commercially successful artist to come out of the city. And you can make that direct link between his style as far as like, rhymes, harmonizing vocals. That that's verse, like verse is the father of that in Portland.
Mhm.
So, yeah, again, that resonates. I'm curious as far as choosing to shout out Crenshaw, choosing to shout out the Lifesavers, like what was it about those artists in particular that really like spoke to you?
Well, for me, that was my generation. That's where I got to know them, you know. Um, Mike was a part of Hip Hop Congress, which I think played a big role in bringing attention to some of these local scenes. And, Mike's been a frequent guest, but, more importantly, Mike Crenshaw, the organizer, Mike Crenshaw, the freedom fighter. And then you forget that Mike Crenshaw got flow, you know. The lifesavers, resist, you know, is a song that was damn near a theme for Hard Knocks. So we always played that, and that's how we became familiar. And then people like Jumbo and producing and all that. So we just got to know people that way. That's what stood out. I'm not familiar with all the new artists. It's not like I have something against Portland, but I just not as familiar because there's so many, and it's hard to keep up. And I think they respectfully speak to a younger generation. So, like some of the folks you mentioned, I mean, yeah, that's for the newer folks to soak up and vibe with them because that's where the spirit touches.
Right. So speaking of influences, you know, like I said, I've followed you for a bit. And I think I don't know, maybe when I look at just why kind of connecting politics and music has been important in some of the work I do, or politics and art, politics and culture, I'm just curious for you, like, who are some of your influences, whether it be hip hop journalism or just in, journalism in general?
Um, my influences change. There's so many. I mean, obviously, coming up in the industry, Chuck T would probably be the biggest influence. In terms of being a good friend and a mentor. Um, that stands out. As a journalist, I would say Greg Tate had a strong influence. I would say Ricky Vincent, had a big influence. I would say the late Natty Prep, those were all people that had influences. Um, who else? My mom was a big influence. It all changes. So, right now, I'm just thinking, it's hard to get Chuck's name, Chuck's image out of my head right now. So I say Chuck would be the biggest one. But I mean, it all, depending on the circumstances that I'm in, will dictate, who influences me because I learned so much from so many people.
Right, right. And that brings me to your partner with this new edition of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. You said you were in college with Jeff, but
Mhm.
I was curious as far as, you know, when you two were coming up in that sort of hip hop journalism space, like, did you feel like you had a lot of peers when it came to to really like explicitly making that connection and really hammering home that point of like, you know, the
Well,
music and again, politics?
I can't speak for Jeff because Jeff, as a journalist, my influence is really coming from I'm going to make my own thing. I didn't work for anybody. I worked for myself. I started my own publication, and it was to accentuate the work that I was doing on college radio. And then that's how I got my job at commercial radio at KMEL, was because I was doing a newsletter and I was chronicling the scene that was going on, and writing about it. And my attitude was, instead of, doing a flyer to say, tune in at such and such a time to hear me do my music, why don't I just do a playlist? Because that would be more useful. People all can use a playlist. And that's what I did. And so my journalism path was that I was writing for myself, and other people eventually would pick me up. So that's how I got to write for The Source. That's how I got to write for, had a column at BAM magazine. That's how I got picked up, to do almost all my jobs, was because I was writing for myself and doing my own website and all that other good stuff. And from that, it kind of opened doors for me to do something in a more commercialized space. So for me, I never felt limitations on the work that I'm doing. I write what I want to write. If you like it, you can pick it up. So to be honest, I never really went through a process of like, we're going to have to kill your article because we don't feel it cuts the mustard. I didn't really have somebody going, I need you to do a cover story on these artists. It was usually like, I'm going to write a story about these artists. Maybe it's good enough. You can put it on the cover. So my entry into this arena was a little bit different, and having that freedom to speak as I see fit is extremely important. And so, my path through radio and other things has always been to have a sense of freedom and autonomy, which I appreciate more and more with each day. So that's my journalistic path. So I have a voice I'm confident in. I have an understanding of what works and what doesn't work, and I have no regrets for the path that I've taken. So that's kind of where I sit on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a gem right there. But yeah, just lastly, for whether it be someone like myself or other people trying to, again, cover the history, cover the story in a place like Portland or some of these places that are, not the big cities, not the, industry hubs. Do you have any other advice you would give, especially when it comes to not just covering the stories, but making sure getting them out to, the rest of the country, the rest of the world?
Well, let me say a couple of things. The industry is made up of people, and people are not perfect, and people are fallible, and people are not the be all end all. Meaning, when I hear the word industry, I often remind people an industry is a corporation that has an agenda. Their agenda usually is to make the bottom line on behalf of their shareholders and other, entities that they, that's invested in them. That can be overwhelming if your goal is like, I need to be the next, big writer at Rolling Stone magazine, or I need to be the next guy that is at a big record label, or I need to be, one of these big name people. Yeah, that path is going to be competitive, and you might make some money if you know how to tap into it right. But a lot of times your voice will be, limited. It's like, okay, you're here now, but you got to toe the company line. When I've written for big newspapers and they say, hey, can you do an article on such and such? There's times that I've done that. I'll be like, sure, I'm going to tell the whole history, and then I'm going to tell the story. And then you hand it in, they're like, oh man, we just wanted we wanted the sensational part. We wanted the part where, he fell down the stairs, or the part where she threw up on herself. It's like, I'm not printing that. I turned down stories. Perfect example. There was a magazine that knew that I was good friends with Chuck, and they wanted me to do a story on why Public Enemy broke up, but they wanted all the salacious details. And it was like, there's no way I'm going to tell that story. They offered me $3,000 to write it. It's like, there's no way that I'm going to do that because that's not the story I want to tell. And, I could use the money, my integrity in my relationship to the culture and to the people was more important. So I turned it down and just wouldn't go there and said, I'll give you something else. And I eventually gave them a story, but it wasn't with all the salacious stuff that they wanted. And so I think that's important to have that sense of purpose and that sense of integrity for the people that you're covering as a journalist, the people that you're writing for as a community. In the commercial realm, they say, well, there's objective journalism. What does that really mean? Objective journalism. Nothing's objective. I'm truthful. And I'm truthful about the fact that I'm going to give voice to the voiceless when I'm covering a story. I'm going to look at the person or the community that doesn't get to tell their story and try to highlight what they're going through. Doesn't mean I have to lie. Doesn't mean I have to dilute. Doesn't mean any of that. What it does mean is that we're giving space to folks who are systemically often locked out and then told that they're locked out because people are being objective. No, they're locked out because they don't make immediate money for you unless you frame them a certain way. And I'm not going to play that framing game. So, Black people, if you're talking about who shot who, that makes money. Black people, if you're gossiping about, what's the latest scandal, that makes money. I'm just not going to be a participant in that. I'm just not. That's not me. Get somebody else. And I could say that I'm not going to do it because the institutions that I do my journalism with are my own, or I have total freedom. So I just don't go in those directions. And I think that's important for anybody that wants to do the type of advocacy journalism that I think I'm doing. The other thing that I would say is to own your stuff. So many people have given gems away and then they don't own it. And I learned the hard way a long time ago when I was in a documentary and I gave them all kind of tidbits and information and, and insight and analysis that they didn't have. And, and that documentary, blew up and it did well, which was fine. I was young, 20 something. I didn't know any better. I was just happy to be on TV. But years later, when we tried to show that documentary, at a museum, we were threatened with a lawsuit, said we own that, not you. And I was like, what? But, we gave all this information. It was our intellect that made this thing what it is. Yeah, but we own it. And so I made sure to always own my stuff and to, rather take less pay and own it than to have more pay to give, jewels and gems that you don't own. So I would say always own your stuff if you possibly can. And don't be afraid to learn new things. That would be the last thing I say. You can always learn from somebody. I'm an expert in hip hop. I'm a historian, but I'll be the first to tell you the 20-year-old, the 18-year-old, the 15-year-old knows what's happening with things that are coming in their direction more than I ever will. So I got to sit back and soak up game from them. And when they need to start moving in particular directions, that's when I can lend my expertise and my years of experience. So it's a reciprocal thing. We all learn from each other. I got some history, and I'm soaking up stuff, as history is being made. So hope that makes sense.
Yeah. And that, especially when we talk about connecting the dots with younger people, I do some creative nonfiction journalism classes with high schools. And I just, actually at the place I'm working now with at McDaniel's, one of the teachers, Jesse Gardner, who also interviewed on this, did a fundraiser for, I think it was 2 class sets of the new Can't Stop, Won't Stop YA version. And it's things like that that just, I am excited to see what students do with it, what students do with, that information. Like, obviously I'm doing, my own projects, but again, I'm 33. I'm not on TikTok. I'm, I'm curious what what that
Right.
looks like through that lens.
Yeah. And, I learned from my kids, I'm not supposed to be on TikTok like that.
Right.
I'm not supposed to be hanging out at the club unless I'm DJing, right? That's
Mhm.
just not my space. Doesn't mean I'm too old or anything. Just it's not my space. They're on a different wavelength. And and so you learn from them, figure out what they're doing and at least be familiar so you can have a good conversation.
Right, right. Well, yeah, Davey D, thank you again
Thank
for
you.
taking the time this morning. And yeah, we're, for people looking to, find more of your work, where can they go?
You can catch me on Mr. Davey D, MrDavEyd, Mr. Davey D at Gmail is always the best. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for? The best. That's my handle. So if you wanted me on IG, Mr. Davey D, Facebook, Mr. Davey D, Twitter, Mr. Davey D, Mixcloud, Mr. Davey D, SoundCloud, Mr. Davey D. So that's where I'm at on all those platforms. MrDavEyd. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
No doubt.